Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 56. Loki and Frigga. Loki only had to hold Barnes in place for about an hour while he was rehydrated via the IV. He remained for a short time after that to make sure his skills would not be required to handle Barnes for some reason, then made good his escape. He spent the scant hours remaining until dawn very quietly, freaking out. As horrible, horrifying, and overall traumatizing as his time at Thanos' hands had been, well, it had only lasted a year and he had gotten free thanks to Thor and the other Avengers. Barnes had not been so lucky, and the state Barnes was in now was a good look at what Loki would have become if Thanos had gotten his way. The poor man seemed to have no will of his own. Loki honestly wondered whether or not the man would breathe. If it was not an automatic process, his body performed without conscious thought. The only sign of life from Barnes had been when Steve was in the room. Even then, it was limited to Barnes's eyes tracking Steve, with no recognition whatever in his eyes or expression. Barnes had not moved anything other than his eyes when Loki hadn't been restraining him. It was enough to give Loki, as the humans said, the willies, a good enough expression for the thoroughly discomfited state of mind he was in right now, which was not a good state of mind to be traveling the secret paths on. Oh, Loki knew he could have called Heimdall and been in Asgard in a trice. Loki was, however, unwilling to trust that Heimdall would do his job. During his recital of events when he, Thor, and the Avengers had come to Asgard, Loki had not spoken of those acts that he knew of, Sif the Three and Heimdall's sedition and would-be treason. There was but one reason for that. The fact that he had, in fact, been doing things that would not have ended well for Asgard. That fact was all that was sparing the Five's lives. There would come a day when Loki was more removed from events, when he had come to terms with all that had happened and all he had discovered, that there would be an accounting amongst them of what they had done. Asgard, under Odin, had been the worst sort of absolute monarchy. Odin's word was law, and unless your name was Thor, and apparently Heimdall, questioning or challenging Odin's word tended to end in, at best, an extended jail sentence, and more frequently in death. Whoever sat the throne during Odin's sleeps was acting as regent only, despite having, for that brief period, the full power of a king. They would answer in full to Odin, who maintained watch over all that was said and done in his sleep when he woke. That had not exactly been a concern when he and Thor had been children and Frigga had taken the throne during Odin's sleeps. It probably wouldn't have been too much of a problem if it had been Thor on the throne either. Loki had not been fool enough to think Odin would have been so magnanimous if he was ever on that throne for whatever reason. Sif and the Three had lost little time in demanding Thor's return. With Gungnir in hand, Loki could have brought him back and restored his powers. That said, it would have been a toss-up as to whether or not, when he woke, Odin would have approved or not. And that disregarded the fact that Thor desperately needed to learn a few lessons and would not do so if he was brought back to Asgard almost before he'd gotten any of Midgard's dust on his boots. Yes, allowing the frost giants into Asgard had been both stupid and wrong. The fact remained that Loki would never have had to do so if either Thor had possessed a shred of humility or the ability to think before he acts, or Odin had been willing to listen to Frigga. Loki had no better than to try. When she attempted to tell Odin that Thor was not ready for the throne, even in the lesser role of King Regent. Something had needed to be done to open Odin's eyes, or get Thor thinking. Loki still shuddered to think of the mess Thor would have made of things if he'd been put on the throne as planned. Sif and the Three had not cared a jot that Thor's actions had threatened to restart a war. Neither they nor Heimdall had cared that Loki could have been attempting to smooth ruffled feathers and regain a more peaceful footing with the Frost Giants. No, it had been all about Thor. Again. At least for Sif and the Three. Heimdall had acted against him simply because he didn't like it, that he could not see what Loki was doing. Which was unconscionable. Not one of them had had proof of any wrongdoing. Worse, they all seemed to forget, because it was Loki, that technically he had not done a single wrong thing, at least until he'd turned the Bifrost on Jotunheim. He had been King Regent, While the region ultimately ended up answering to Odin for their actions, they operated under the same rules that Odin did, which is to say that their word was law, and technically speaking, they could do no wrong. So yes, the only reason Loki hadn't spoken of their treachery and gotten a lot of them killed was because he had been less than sane and doing things that needed to be stopped. For that reason and that reason alone, he was willing to spare their lives. Someday, however, he was going to call each and every one of them to account for it. Loki shook such dark and unsettling thoughts off with a tremendous effort and worked to calm down. Once he was sure he had, he glanced up. "Jarvis, if you would inform Tony that I have left to go speak to Mother." "Of course, Mr. Ferguson," Jarvis said immediately. Jarvis teleported out of the tower and headed for the nearest safe path that led to Asgard. It had been Frigga, of course, who had first taught Loki about the secret paths. She had discovered in her youth a number of the larger, safer paths between several of the realms. To this day, she used one such path to visit her family on Vanaheim. That path had even been Loki's first exposure to the paths. Frigga, however, had never possessed Loki's adventurous spirit. Oh, he'd never liked Thor's version of adventure, largely because it invariably involved killing mass numbers of beings or animals and risking his own death and the deaths of his compatriots. But Loki had adored exploring and investigating mysteries nearly as much as he adored reading. Such adventures, after all, accumulated knowledge, and Loki enjoyed learning. Introduced to those paths, Loki had been quick to look for more, and he'd found them. Many of them were unusable for a variety of reasons, but he'd found at least 2 passable paths to every realm, and as many as 5 passable paths between 2 realms. Midgard, for whatever reason, was the realm with the most passable paths to the other realms. It had 4 passable paths to Asgard alone, and almost 24 more split between the other inhabited realms. One of the paths to Asgard lay in the Irondark Mountains, to the north of Manhattan. It took but a moment to teleport there, and less than an hour to traverse the path. The path led out in the mountains above the palace. Loki teleported to the palace just outside the throne room. Fortune smiled on him in that Frigga was ensconced on the throne. With what they were facing in a year's time, she could easily have been elsewhere for some reason. Loki did a double take when he saw her. If Frigga had been wearing the armor Tyr had told them of during her aborted visit with Farbati, Loki had been too busy to notice or care. Seeing her now was rather a shock, mostly because he recognized the elements she'd borrowed from his own armor. While Loki loved her unreservedly in the face of, well, everything, an insidious part of him had begun to question, if quietly, whether or not she truly cared for him in any wise, much less as a son. Even her obvious relief and joy at seeing him when he'd come here with the Avengers had not been enough to silence that voice entirely. This silenced that voice completely. Armor on Asgard was rather individualized. Within the constraints necessary to provide protection, there were innumerable variations on colors, styles, and materials. Boys tended to use elements of their father's armor to both identify themselves with their father on the battlefield and to honor their father. Even Sif, despite being female and her pursuit of the warrior path not much approved of by her father, had elements of her father's armor evident in her own. It had rather been a symptom of Loki's increasing distance with Odin that there had been virtually no resemblance between Loki's armor and his, save the gold color of the metal. That and the fact he'd chosen green as his color rather than red had caused no end of comment. That Thor had chosen silver rather than gold, on the other hand, hadn't raised a single eyebrow. Perhaps because, despite the color difference, the metal parts of Thor's armor had strongly resembled Odin's. In that wise, to see Frigga in armor that so clearly, blatantly possessed elements of his own armor, elements that the court would recognize, was quite the statement. Without saying a word, Frigga was proclaiming for all to see that she was proud to claim Loki as her son. Such thoughts were driven from his mind, however, within seconds of Frigga spotting him. She shot to her feet, eyes wide with surprise. "Loki! Loki almost had a heart attack when Frigga cast Gungnir aside as if it were of no import whatever, then came as near to running as he'd ever seen her as she descended the steps from the throne and crossed the room. She almost skidded to a stop, a few feet away.
Loki, I am so sorry. I acted rashly and without thought and hurt you at a time when you could ill afford such unthinking cruelty,
Frigga said, her voice pitched for his ears alone. It was one of the reasons Loki loved her so. She understood almost instinctively that he wouldn't want it brayed about the castle, that he was vulnerable in some way. Well, that and the fact she was one of the pitiful few who had ever apologized for their actions. Oh, and the fact she'd always supported him as best she could. Alright, if Loki was going to be completely honest with himself, he was a mama's boy. Not without a myriad of reasons, either. He didn't have it in him to hate her or hold on to her rare mistakes as regarded him against her.
It is forgiven and forgotten, Mother,
Loki told her, holding out a hand she was quick to grab and tug him closer by so that she could embrace him. Loki permitted it with a fond eye roll, but extricated himself after a moment.
I am afraid my visit is not a purely social one, Mother,
he admitted. Frigga was nearly dizzy with relief, both because Loki had been so quick to forgive her and because he'd been so quick to extricate himself from her hug. The latter was a sign he was starting to regain his emotional and mental footing somewhat, as he had never been one to permit public displays of affection without complaints or attempts to evade them. Too, he was looking better. He'd lost the bruised look he'd been sporting when last he'd been on Asgard. He still looked tired, which made Frigga strongly suspect he wasn't sleeping, but given the circumstances, a lack of sleep was hardly surprising. She'd worry about that if he still looked tired in a week or so. At that point, he'd be risking mucking up if he used magic, which he knew very well. So if he still wasn't sleeping at that point, it would be a cause for concern.
I feared it would not be, with Thanos to be concerned with,
Frigga said, as she briefly headed back to the throne long enough to reclaim Gungnir.
Come, we'll talk in the office.
She led them to the side room that Odin had claimed millennia ago as a place to meet in private with high-ranking visitors and to do the inevitable paperwork that came with being a monarch. Frigga settled herself not behind the desk, but in one of the chairs in front of it, and motioned for Loki to take the other, which he did.
So, what is it that brings you?
Frigga asked. Loki told her. Frigga was, in a word, appalled. That such a thing had been done at all was horrifying. That it had been done to a man of such impeccable character and morals, for she could not see Captain Rogers calling friend someone who was evil-hearted, was even worse.
You are the best when it comes to healing, Mother. I do not know if you can help him, but it was worth the asking,
Loki concluded.
Frigga nodded emphatically. Of course, I will see what I can do for him. I will need a few hours to prepare. I must inform the court I will be absent for a time, and then gather such things as I think I might need for this endeavor. You may stay, if you wish, or return to Midgard and let them know I'm coming. I'll arrive via Bifrost.
Loki considered that for a moment, then said,
I believe I shall return. By your leave, my queen.
Frigga gave him an amused look. Go, you scamp, she told him. Once he'd left, Frigga quickly spoke with the court and Tyr to let them know she'd be gone for the day at least, perhaps longer. It would depend on the state Mr. Barnes was in, which she would not know until she started working on him. Then she gathered up a healer's bag and a normal bag into which she placed a few of the more esoteric healing aids. Another bag was loaded with the few accoutrements she might need if magic was called for. She ran into Sif as she was heading to the stable to collect Aiden.
My queen, where are you headed? Midgard. Things there are happening apace. They have need of my healing skills for a man they found,
Frigga told her. Well, not the truth. It was close enough, and a lot faster than the whole truth in this case.
May I accompany you? I would speak with Loki, if I may,
Sif said. Frigga considered her for a moment, but she didn't get the sense that Sif wanted to antagonize Loki. Sif had been rather quiet since that day on the bridge. Frigga had a feeling Sif had been doing a lot of thinking in that time. And aside from that, Frigga still wanted to get the ladies Sif and Natasha in the same room. That acquaintance would bear remarkable fruit unless she was very much mistaken.
Very well.
Frigga said. The two of them rode to Heimdall Station and were soon, minus their mounts, on the roof of Stark Tower. They were met by Stark himself. Queen Frigga. He peered at Sif. Lady Sif, right?
Correct,
Sif said with a nod. Come on, Barnes is inside. They were led to a room that seemed remarkably barren, save for a colorful patchwork quilt thrown on the bed that lay against one wall. It seemed a somewhat larger variation on the cells in Asgard's dungeons until Stark explained its usual purpose. Barnes himself ignored all three of them utterly. Frigga, as politely as she could, sent both Stark and Sif from the room. Their presences would provide only a distraction. She was more than able to prevent Barnes from attacking her if he suddenly attempted to do so. Frigga performed her own examination of Barnes's body. As the others had averred, there was no recent physical damage. That said, she detected several foreign bodies, each attached to Barnes' spine, that had apparently evaded the Avengers' detection. She suspected they had escaped detection due to there being very little metal, and the fact that the foreign bodies were not, at the moment, performing any function she could detect. There were two more such bodies in the narrow space between Barnes's skull and his brain.
Mr. Stark, she said when she'd finished with that scan, I am given to understand you wish to construct a new arm for Mr. Barnes.
Yeah, Tony told her. I don't trust that one. I don't know who built it or what they programmed it to do.
Frigga nodded. When you have the new arm ready, send word to Asgard. Our medical facilities will be required for the transfer. This arm is attached to his body in such a way as to make it impossible to remove, by what I understand are existing Midgardian methods, without killing him.
Gotcha. Will do, Tony said with a nod.
There are several foreign bodies laid against his spine and under his skull. I fear these bodies exist to perform evil purposes, but what they can do I cannot tell, as none of them are active at the moment. They too will require removal.
That done, Frigga settled herself and began the extremely delicate task of ascertaining what state Barnes's mind was in, and whether or not she could do anything to bring him back to himself. Several hours later, she gave her head a shake and sighed, before gently stroking Barnes's hair in quiet sympathy.
The bad news is that I cannot bring him back to himself, she said. To bring those memories forward would do as much damage to his mind as burying them did. That said, there is good news. The blocks keeping those memories at bay are already beginning to unravel on their own. Given time, as little as a matter of weeks, perhaps even days, he will begin to remember, and eventually all his memories will return on their own. I removed several traps in his mind, things that would have driven him to violence or to obey without question if certain things were said or seen.
Frigga continued.
While I am unable to bring his memories forward, I have blunted the emotional impact that the memories of his time in the hands of his captors will have on them as he regains those memories. He will still be able to feel the emotions the events bring up, but those emotions will be unable to consume him.
Which was a roundabout way of saying that Barnes would not be driven to suicide by the emotional impact of the enormity of what he'd been forced to endure, become, and do at the hands of his captors. Frigga dearly wished she could do more for him. But his mind was so fragile, anything more than she had already done would do more harm than good.